information shared during this presentation is intended to be general strategies to supplement individualized intervention, not a replacement. If you have specific concerns, please reach out to a medical provider, a behavior analyst, your speech language pathologist. Each thing that we're going to talk about is very unique to each individual child. This is just intended to be general information and give you a starting place where you can individualize your child's journey from there. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the neurodiversity movement. We're going to be talking about the autism diagnostic criteria and then looking at that from a strengths-based lens. We're going to talk about the spectrum of strengths and support needs for children who are on the autism spectrum, including communication, socialization, repetitive behavior, and sensory needs. So I want to go ahead and get started on this presentation today by talking about the neurodiversity movement, because this is going to give us the lens with which we're going to look at all of the rest of the content today. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the neurodiversity movement is a social justice movement, and it focuses on ideas that diversity is a biologically natural and healthy part of any species, including the human species, and therefore differences in brain functioning and brain development are just that. They're differences and not deficits. It goes along with the belief that there are many different ways that people perceive and interact with the world around them, and that there isn't one right way to think, learn, and behave. So we're really going to be focusing today on not looking at the deficits associated with being on the autism spectrum, but looking at it as differences in the way that the brain functions, the way that people think, act, and behave. So there's a few different terms involved in the neurodiversity movement. So neurodiversity just means the natural variation and diversity of human brains. So this could include autism, ADHD, dyslexia, a variety of different neurological conditions. Neurodiverse is a group of people with different brain types. So neurodiverse means that there are people who are neurodivergent, meaning that they have brains that are different from what would be considered socially the normal functioning brain, and people who are neurotypical. So neurodivergent and neurotypical, we'll talk about that as well. Neurodivergent is a person whose brain functions differently than what is perceived as normal by society. And neurotypical is a person whose brain functions, I'm sorry, that says differently, but it should say normally, as what is perceived by society. So people who are neurotypical have what would be typical development in terms of social development, brain development, things like that. People who are neurodivergent, that includes people on the autism spectrum, people with ADHD and dyslexia. So today we're going to be talking about neurodivergence as a whole, but that just kind of breaks down where you would use those different terms. So a person would be neurodivergent or neurotypical. A group of people would refer to neurodiverse. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a change in perspective. So we have the medical perspective of autism or neurodivergence, and the medical perspective kind of approaches things as children with brain differences have deficits and should learn to think, learn, and behave the same way as neurotypical children. So this is looking at things like, what are the deficits associated with neurodiversity and neurodivergence? And so if they were looking at a child with autism spectrum, they would think that they expect them to adapt themselves to the environment to succeed, pushing them to mask neurodivergent traits to act normal. In the sense of what society perceives as normal. And then the way that neurodivergent children think and behave needs to be fixed. And the goal is for them to become, quote unquote, normal. So this is the historical medical perspective towards autism, ADHD, and other neurological conditions, where they would look at a child, diagnose them, and perceive them as having deficits that need to be fixed. But the neurodiversity movement is really shifting that perspective towards a more neurodiversity-affirming perspective, is that children with brain differences should be supported in learning to advocate for their needs and differences. So you would look more for accommodations and modifications made to the environment rather than trying to push the child to adapt themselves to the environment that they're in. It would look at accepting unique traits and preferences without masking. So rather than trying to push the child to act normal, they would teach them to communicate their needs and their differences so that they can be accepted as they are with their traits. Neurodivergent children need to be accepted and supported, not fixed. So again, we're not looking to fix those unique traits in a child. We're looking to support them in how they can express themselves, communicate their wants and needs, and communicate to others what their preferences are in learning, acting, and behaving. The goal is acceptance, inclusion, and communication. So the neurodiversity movement is really looking to help society as a whole understand what the unique traits and support needs are for neurodivergent individuals and move towards society as a whole accepting them, including them, and really considering the needs of neurodivergent people rather than trying to push them to adapt to the norms of society. And then it also focuses on that communication piece. So as we talk about, intervention and therapy and things like that, the neurodiversity movement is really pushing towards how can a neurodivergent individual communicate clearly their wants and needs rather than teaching them to go along with what the expectations are for them, right? So it's more focused on how can they communicate clearly and effectively with everyone around them. Okay, so why neurodiversity matters. So the neurodiversity movement really encourages equity in social, academic, and vocational settings. So traditionally, all children are expected to, kind of conform to a certain way of learning, a certain way of behaving in social settings and things like that. So a lot of that leaves a lot of children left out and isolated from those experiences if their specific unique needs and traits don't go along with what school or community settings expect that from them. So the neurodiversity movement is really encouraging equity in considering all individuals with all different, social approaches, communication approaches to be involved and included in these different settings, whether it's work, school, social settings, community settings. It also focuses on each individual's unique strengths. So again, rather than looking at it from a deficit perspective of what is wrong with the individual, it's what are their unique strengths and how can we focus and highlight those in order to uplift them and help them to be successful in their, social, academic, and vocational endeavors. And it also pushes for a more inclusive, accepting society, which we already spoke about, of looking at how can society as a whole consider everyone's individual needs and how can we move towards an approach that allows individuals who were traditionally isolated from different settings to be considered and have their needs adapted to so that they can also participate. And it celebrates the benefits of differences in diversity. So it really looks at, we wouldn't want everyone to think and behave in the same way. There's a lot of benefit to having diverse schools of thought, diverse perspectives in the world. And it also advocates for differences to be accepted instead of viewed as deficits or negative traits. So this is why the neurodiversity movement is really beneficial to individuals who are on the autism spectrum, who have ADHD or different neurological conditions, because it's really an approach that's working towards not just helping the individual, but society as a whole. So now we're going to move into autism. And we're going to look at what is the diagnostic criteria according to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that outlines the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. But then we're going to shift it and look at it from a strengths-based lens and a neurodiversity-affirming lens. So here's what the diagnostic criteria states. The symptoms must be present in early developmental period. That doesn't mean that individuals can't be diagnosed in adulthood. There just needs to be some notation that these sorts of symptoms were present when they were children. It has to cause significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So it has to have some sort of significant impact on the individual's ability to develop and maintain relationships with others, to be successful in their, occupational and career endeavors, in school and at home. And it focuses on two areas: social communication and restrictive and repetitive behavior. So in the social communication domain, there has to be persistent deficits in each of the three areas. Those are social emotional reciprocity, nonverbal communicative behavior, and developing and maintaining relationships. So we're going to go more in depth and break down what do those means, because that's pretty technical terms, but we're going to break down what it means from a strengths-based lens. So we have to have those three areas of social communication behavior. And then we also have to have at least 2 of 4 types of restrictive repetitive behavior, interests, or activities. And so we have to have 2 of these 4: repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, inflexible routines, ritualized patterns of behavior, resistance to change in routines, highly restricted and fixated interests, hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input. So again, we're going to break each of these down and look at what do these mean from an individual's perspective, and how can we look at these from a strengths-based lens. So now we're going to talk about the spectrum of strengths and support needs. So traditionally, a lot of people thought of autism spectrum disorder, that term spectrum, as this one here on the right, of high functioning versus low functioning. And it was pretty common to use these terms even just a couple of years ago, of saying, and it still happens today, of, my child has autism and they are high functioning or low functioning. But really, when we're talking about a spectrum of strengths and support needs, we should be thinking of this one here on the left. It's a wheel. And your child might have strengths or support needs that are different in each of these different domains. So maybe you have a child who really has strong communication skills. They're able to clearly communicate their wants and needs, but they really struggle with emotion regulation, or they have a hard time being flexible when there's a change in routine. Maybe your child has some incredible strengths in their special interests, but struggles to communicate clearly. So rather than it being one spectrum of high functioning versus low functioning, this is acknowledging that every brain is different and has variation. And, autism spectrum disorder doesn't mean that your child has deficits in every area of their brain functioning, right? It might just be a few of these areas that are impacted, whereas their neurodivergence is actually causing strengths in other areas like special interests, or sometimes we have children who are really talented in pattern recognition and other areas where they would not have those specific strengths had they not also had these other deficits that come with it, right? So we want to think about not high functioning versus low functioning as a whole, but what are their specific strengths and support needs in each of these different areas. Okay, so now we're going to break down each of those areas that we talked about when we were talking about the diagnostic and statistical manuals criteria for diagnosis. So we're going to talk about speech. So 60% of individuals on the autism spectrum use vocal speech to communicate, but that can vary by context. So a lot of individuals in society perceive individuals on the autism spectrum as either verbal or nonverbal. But there's really kind of a myth about that if a child is verbal, then they can speak to communicate. And if they're nonverbal, then they can't. When in reality, there's a huge spectrum of skills when it comes to verbal speech and vocal speech. So when a child is speaking to communicate and they're on the autism spectrum, they might be able to speak to communicate with some people or in some settings and not in others. So depending on the context, what is the activity, where is the location, who are they with, they might be more or less willing to use their speech or able to use their speech to communicate. And then some kids who are considered nonverbal may be able to speak, but aren't able to use it consistently to communicate their wants and needs. So in reality, it's not speaking versus non-speaking. It's what are your child's speech skills in a variety of different settings. Maybe they're able to really clearly communicate about their specific areas of interest to them, but then have a hard time with daily functioning and things like that. So you might notice that your child can communicate at home very well, but then has a hard time speaking at school or things like that. Speech may have differences in prosody, tone, or volume of speech. So prosody is just the rhythm. So some people describe it as like robotic-like speech, or it might sound like singing. So it could be very different depending on the child. So again, you'll notice throughout this presentation that when we talk about characteristics of autism, you're going to see the words they may, some, because every child with autism is different and are individuals, and the way that they have autism presents differently for them. So by no means is any of the information shared during today going to be across the board apply to all children on the autism spectrum. So what you might relate to some of these things and you might think, oh, that doesn't describe my child, and that's okay. This is going to look different for every child. Some of these things might be more of the stereotypical, what you would imagine. And then for some kids, it doesn't look like that at all. So for some kids, they might have more of what would be like stilted speech or robotic speech, and others might sound like they're singing when they talk, or they might talk very softly or very loud. They might have a hard time controlling the volume of their speech. So it can look different, but generally there's some sort of difference in their speech. So there's also augmentative and alternative communication. The acronym for that is AAC, which is what a lot of people hear is the acronym rather than the description, but AAC stands for augmentative alternative communication. So some individuals on the autism spectrum use other forms of communication to communicate their wants and needs or to supplement their speech. So some use PECS, picture exchange communication. So you can see a picture of a traditional PECS book there on the left. Now, it doesn't have to be a book like this. It doesn't have to be PECS per se, which is an actual packaged program from a company. However, it just means that pictures are being used to communicate. So the traditional approach to PECS is that a child, picks a picture of something that they want to communicate out of their book and hands it to their communication partner. So maybe they're asking for help or they're asking for juice, anything it might be. Some individuals on the autism spectrum use sign language or gestures to communicate their needs. Others use speech generating devices. So this is a picture of, obviously it's an animated picture of an example speech generating device. It might be an iPad or a tablet that has an AAC app downloaded onto it, or it might be a dedicated device from that you might get from your speech language provider or something like that. But this is where children are pressing, or individuals, it could be adults, pressing buttons to navigate through their device and communicating their needs. They might use single pictures, full sentences, they might type. So it could look like a variety of things. But when we're looking at a child's communication skills, we want to be looking at all the different ways that they can communicate, and consider the fact that in some situations, they might be able to communicate with speech, and in other situations, they might be able to, they might need these augmentative things like speech communication, picture communication, speech generating devices, sign language. One person in our group just pointed out that PECS, the company, is widely known not to be neurodiversity affirming. Thank you for pointing that out. That was not intended to be an advertisement for that program. I was just giving an example of something that some families might be using. I'm not going to be advertising or not advertising any particular communication means. I just want to be inclusive of everyone's potential uses of different communication. So again, some individuals might be able to talk, some might have to use these augmentative communication, and we want to be able to consider how can our child best use their current skills to communicate their wants and needs. Because at the end of the day, what's important is that they're able to communicate, not whether they're able to speak, right? Obviously, for some families, that's the goal and they hope their child gets there. But we want to be able to consider right now, how are we best able to support our child in communicating their needs? So communication. We also want to think about language. So some individuals on the autism spectrum may have delays in the development of communication skills to clearly communicate their wants and needs. Again, not all. Some are able to communicate really, really effectively, and others really need that support from a speech language pathologist or other therapists in order to develop those communication skills. And their language use may differ. Some individuals on the autism spectrum might be considered to have formal, direct, or literal communication styles. So they might have a hard time understanding figurative or sarcastic language. Um, they might be very direct in their communication, and individuals who are not familiar with the communication styles of individuals who are neurodivergent might consider it to be rude, when in reality, they might just be very direct about how they are using their communication to communicate their wants and needs or their ideas with others. And there's also non-vocal communication to consider. So this might be facial expressions, gestures and body language, and eye contact. When we consider facial expressions for individuals on the autism spectrum, facial expressions may not always correspond with their emotions. They might not express themselves with facial expressions that corresponds with how they're feeling or what they're trying to communicate to another person. And they might not pick on communication cues from facial expressions of others. Again, individuals on the autism spectrum tend to be very literal and direct with their communication, and they may best understand that when it's communicated verbally through other people as well. If you are expressing yourself through facial expressions and not also corresponding that with how the words that you're using to communicate to an individual on the autism spectrum, they may have a hard time picking up on those cues from facial expressions. So they might need support in understanding and interpreting those facial expressions. Gestures and body language. Again, individuals on the autism spectrum may rely on verbal communication rather than gestures, body language, facial expressions to convey and interpret meaning during an interaction with another person. And they may have stiff body language. Again, a lot of individuals on the autism spectrum engage in some self-stimulatory behavior, also known as stimming. So they might be using their hands and their body to move in other ways to self-regulate, which we'll talk about later. And they might not be using gestures and body language along with their verbal communication. Eye contact, for many individuals on the autism spectrum who are self-advocates, they've communicated that some individuals with autism find eye contact to be uncomfortable. So you might want to consider other ways to check for attention and understanding. For some, it's described as like a discomfort. For some, it's extremely, they would describe it as painful or causing a degree of distress to make eye contact. And so in those situations where they're being pressured to make eye contact with another person, they then might be focusing so much on self-regulating and trying to maintain eye contact that whatever's trying to be communicated or the meaning behind that social interaction is then lost for that person and they're not able to participate in a meaningful way. So if you have a child who's on the autism spectrum, you might not want to focus on encouraging that eye contact and instead find ways for them to communicate to others that they are paying attention or understanding. So that might be, for if you're trying to work on your child responding to name, for example, maybe they can just say yes, or maybe they can just slightly turn their head in your direction, but you want to make sure that you're being inclusive of all the different ways that they can maybe consider or maybe demonstrate that they're paying attention or that they're understanding, besides just relying on them making eye contact, right? Because that's a social norm that we have, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way that an individual can connect with another person, pay attention to another person. So social emotional reciprocity also includes conversations. So individuals on the autism spectrum may have a preference for in-depth conversations about special interest topics over small talk. So a lot of individuals have special interests, which will be later on in that restrictive repetitive domain, right? But they might have a passion about a specific topic or activity, and they might really enjoy communicating and sharing those interests with others, whereas they may not prefer to engage in small talk conversations. Um, a term for this in the neurodivergent community is info dumping. So they prefer to just give all of the information that they have on a topic and discuss it in depth, where one person is speaking almost like a monologue, and then the communication partner takes a turn. So one communication partner is speaking and providing information, and the listener is just listening, and then they might switch roles rather than a social norm traditional small talk where it's back and forth, where one person asks the question, the other answers, asks the question back, and they go back and forth. This might be very overwhelming to an individual who is on the autism spectrum, and they might rather prefer to just have one person speaking, the other listening, and then maybe later on in the conversation, switching roles. They may also find it difficult to navigate social rules around conversations, again, like starting with small talk first, or asking the other person reciprocal questions, or turn taking. Again, those rules have to, social rules have to be learned for everyone, but for some, those rules might be really overwhelming for them to have to try to remember and consider during a conversation. And again, if we're trying to make a person who is neurodivergent focus on social rules like eye contact, small talk, things like that, they might get so overly focused on trying to follow the social rules that then they're not able to meaningfully participate in that social interaction, which can lead to more social withdrawal and anxiety in those situations. So you may want to discover, especially if you have a little one, as they age, how they prefer to engage in conversations or interactions, and then help them communicate those preferences to others. Social emotional reciprocity also includes sustaining and initiating interactions. They may find social rules around how to initiate social interaction confusing or overwhelming, or they may rely on scripts of conversations or interactions. And so this is part of that masking. Again, masking just means that they're trying to hide their autistic traits or their neurodivergent traits and act more what society would consider normal, right? So they might learn that individuals don't accept them when they act that way, so they're supposed to act more normal. And so they might try to learn scripts of conversations. So that's where you would notice maybe overly formal, or they might talk or express themselves in ways that sound very similar to TV shows that they've watched or things like that, because they're trying to learn the rules around conversations through those preferred interests. So they might use scripts of conversations, which limits their ability to truly express how they're feeling and thinking. They may prefer virtual interactions that don't require interpreting nonverbal communication. So because individuals on the autism spectrum may require some support in learning how to interpret the meaning of facial expressions, gestures, body language, things like that, that can be a little bit overwhelming to try to listen to what a person is saying and then take in all of that other information and try to put it together to determine meaning. When they're doing a virtual interaction like texting, phone calls, chatting in groups, things like that, it doesn't require them to be observing the other individual and trying to take in all of that extra communication that's coming from body language, facial expressions, things like that. And they may end conversations or interactions abruptly or start them abruptly, again, because they're very direct and literal with their communication styles a lot of times. And so they may need support in learning how to end that conversation in an effective way that helps them maintain those relationships. Establishing and maintaining friendships. So there's a lot of research right now that individuals on the autism spectrum tend to be excluded from a lot of social groups. And so there's really a focus on trying to learn how to maintain and establish those friendships, and how can families and schools help foster these relationships. So they may express and respond to emotions differently. There's kind of this prejudice stereotype that individuals on the autism spectrum don't empathize or understand how other people are feeling. But in reality, many times they tend to be very empathetic. They're just not sure how to express and respond to other people's expressions of emotions. They may not engage in social and verbal interactions, or they may be that are expected to maintain friendships, right? So they might, because they might need support in understanding social rules, such as how to start and end conversations, making sure that other individuals have a turn to communicate during conversations, things like that. They might have a hard time maintaining friendships, because if other people are not aware of their communication styles and preferences, then they might perceive that as rude. And for little ones and even into adulthood, they may prefer parallel play interactions, where they're playing next to or in close proximity to a friend or a peer or a family member, or they might prefer to engage in a shared special interest activity, right? So rather than trying to push children who are on the autism spectrum to engage in interactive play in activities that they might not be interested in, they may prefer to play with their own set of whatever their activity is in close proximity to their peer or friend, and then be playing side by side rather than interacting with one shared activity, unless it's a special interest activity or something that they are really engaged in. Again, that's not every child on the autism spectrum, but some prefer that over that interaction of playing together with a shared activity. Now we're going to move into restrictive and repetitive behavior, which is that second group of symptoms as the DSM would describe it. But we're going to be looking at it as what are the unique traits and strengths. So when it comes to the restrictive side of behavior, individuals on the autism spectrum may prefer consistent routines, schedules, and rules or expectations. It tends to help when you clearly communicate what the activities of the day or what is going to happen within an activity, and what they can expect during that activity, so that they're better prepared for what might happen. Some people use a visual schedule, as you can see here on the right, to help visually organize the day. And a lot of individuals on the autism spectrum really thrive when the activities are in a consistent schedule. They may have intense focus on special interests, like we talked about. They may have a limited variety of interests and activities. So a lot of individuals on the autism spectrum tend to be very passionate about a limited set of subjects, and they may not be as interested in playing with as wide of a variety of toys and topics as a child who is neurotypical. So they may overly focus on a couple of things, but then they develop a deep interest and passion in those interests and activities. They also may have difficulty with changes, transitions, disruptions to their activities. They may prefer to finish an activity as a whole before they move on to the next thing. And they might tend to get upset when there's a disruption to finishing an activity, when there's a transition from one activity to the other, or when something that typically happens in a routine or schedule is changed. So if there's a substitute teacher, if they miss the bus, if typically you always go a certain route on the way to school and there's a closed road and you have to go a different way, these kinds of unexpected changes to the routine can cause a lot of distress in individuals on the autism spectrum, because they tend to thrive in environments when it's predictable and routine based. Okay, now we're going to talk about repetitive behavior. So repetitive movements or actions include self-stimulatory behavior. So this might look a lot of different ways. It might include hand flapping, rocking back and forth are kind of the traditional ones we think about, but it can also be other things, spinning. It could be putting a child's hand in front of their face. It could look like chewing on fingers, chewing on nails, things like that. So it could be a variety of different behaviors that are just repetitive in nature. Might be repetitive use of objects, play actions with toys, fidgeting with objects. It could be repetitive speech, phrases, or sounds. So that's what's described as scripting. So again, repeating a song, a sound, or a phrase that they have heard. Some children, they engage in just vocalizations of just making repetitive noises. Others might repeat back an entire song or an entire part of a show that they've watched they really enjoy. So this can look a lot of different ways for different kids. Again, you can see this kid in this picture is lining up his toys. This one is fidgeting with poppets. So it's just repetitive behavior with objects, with movement, with speech and sounds. And a lot of times this is due to sensory processing differences. So we're going to talk about what those might look like. So individuals on the autism spectrum might be hypersensitive or hyposensitive to sensory input. So hypersensitive just means that they are experiencing that sensory event with a heightened senses. So they might get overwhelmed in that case. So sensory overwhelm can happen where they're getting too much sensory input. And this is not just children with autism, this is with ADHD and different types of neurodiversity. So it could be bright lights, loud noises or crowds, touch or textures, food tastes and textures, or smells. So it could be any of the different types of senses: taste, a sight, smell, noise. So bright lights can be really overwhelming, or crowds because of loud noises, people touching them. It could be really bright lights in that environment. There's a lot to see, and so that can be overwhelming. Food tastes and textures, which is why some people on the autism spectrum tend to have limited acceptance of foods. They might have a really restricted diet, and that's because they might have a hard time with the textures, the tastes, or the smells involved with different foods. Individuals on the autism spectrum can also be hyposensitive to sensory input, which means that they're not experiencing that sensory stimulation to as high of a degree as a neurotypical person would. And so they're not receiving enough sensory stimulation from the environment. And that's what leads to self-stimulatory behavior like rocking, hand flapping, chewing on things, putting things in their mouths, all different kinds of motor, vocal, or oral sensory seeking. They might be underreactive to pain. So if your child on the autism spectrum tends not to react how you'd expect when they fall or hurt themselves, it could be because they're underreactive to that pain, or they're just not expressing it in the same way that a typical person would. And then fidgeting or restlessness. So if your kiddo has a hard time staying still, or they tend to move with their hands or engage in different sensory stimming behaviors, it's because they're not receiving enough sensory stimulation from the environment. To no one's fault, they just perceive things differently. So they might engage in these sensory seeking behaviors. And that's why it's really important to consider your child's sensory needs and consider how they prefer to get sensory input and self-regulate versus trying to stop that sensory seeking behavior. So if your child does engage in a lot of repetitive behavior, I would not look at it as a problem to be fixed. I would look at how are they perceiving their environment, what sensory differences might they have, and how can I support them in getting those sensory needs met. If we try to just suppress sensory seeking behavior, like if you try to stop your child from hand flapping, stimming, or repeating vocal statements, it could cause a lot of distress because that's how they are taking in their environment and coping and self-regulating. So again, this could look a lot of different ways for self-stimulatory behavior. It could be rocking, hand flapping, bouncing, spinning. For visual self-stimulatory behavior, it could be hyper-focusing on images, lights, or other visual stimuli. So shadows or light beams might be of particular interest, pictures or images, items that are moving. It could be auditory, so listening to the same song repeatedly or the same portion of a song or video, repeating the same phrases over and over, which is scripting, and making vocalizations. There's also oral tactile. So again, some individuals on the autism spectrum are oral sensory seekers. So they like to be chewing something, mouthing items. They might like to feel certain things with texture. So they might have preferences for certain textures and find those soothing or enjoyable. They might also tap or scratch to help self-regulate. So again, this is how they are controlling the sensory input that they're getting from the environment in order to help them cope with whatever the demands of that environment may be. So strengths of autism spectrum, it could include a deep knowledge and talents related to special interests. A lot of individuals on the autism spectrum, though they might have some delays academically in some areas, it could just be because of their difficulties with dealing with the sensory environment, with the school not understanding how to best support them, things like that. But they might also have some real talents in things that they are special interest to them. So a lot of individuals on the autism spectrum, but not all, have a lot of interest in letters, numbers, shapes, patterns, things like that. So they tend to be really talented in areas like math, reading, pattern recognition, so things like algebra and things like that. Honest and straightforward communication. Again, they tend to be very direct and literal, so they'll tell you exactly what they're thinking and feeling, hopefully, unless they're masking those traits because they don't feel welcome or accepted. But they tend to be very honest with their communication. There's usually a lot of empathy and strong sense of justice. Individuals on the autism spectrum, as we spoke about, have a preference for routines, set consistent rules and expectations. And so they tend to have a strong sense of justice when they feel like someone is not being treated fairly according to those, routines, expectations, or rules. And there's a strong sense of empathy. Again, a misconception that's pretty common is that individuals on the autism spectrum don't empathize with others, or they don't understand others' emotions, when really it's just that they might not express that empathy in the way that we would expect them to, or they might not be able to know how to comfort or soothe that person in a way that they prefer. They might be skilled in developing routines and systems. So again, individuals on the autism spectrum tend to be very talented in pattern recognition because of their preference for repetition, for patterns, for routines. They're able to kind of look at these routines and systems in place and develop one that works best to help them. And they can also apply that to other situations. So they tend to be very unique and creative on their perspectives of things because they tend to look at things a little differently than a neurotypical person would. They have a strong memory, especially related to special interests. So they tend to have a lot of deep knowledge about special subjects, but in general, they tend to have a good sense of memory because they are perceiving their sensory environment in a different way than a neurotypical person would. And visual perception and pattern recognition skills, like I said, kids on the autism spectrum tend to be really talented in things like puzzles. Again, not all, it depends on what your child's specific skills and traits are. This is just giving you a perspective of all different individuals on the spectrum. So before we get into a couple of change makers that I wanted to take note of, I did want to talk really quickly about how we can look at our children's autism from a strengths-based lens and looking at each of their autistic traits as a unique trait for them rather than just the autism itself, right? So you can look at your child as whole and think about what are their specific preferences and support needs in the areas of communication, building relationships, coping with their environment through self-stimulatory behavior. You can look at all of those things and think, how can I best help my child communicate these preferences with their environment, rather than how can I stop my child from doing this, right? So we want to be looking at, each child's individual traits and finding the strengths that you can build off of. So rather than trying to, get rid of the autism, there's a lot that their autism brings to the table, right? We just reviewed all of those strengths. So rather, what are my child's preferences and support needs? And how can I incorporate those preferences when I think about how to support my child? So when it comes to communication, if your child is speaking at home and not necessarily ready to speak when they're out in the community or at a new place, what other methods of communication can I bring pictures for them? Can I teach them some important signs so that they can ask for help or breaks? Can I help them by changing the environment to make it more tolerable for them, right? So rather than we need to fix the child to fit the environment, thinking we need to fix the environment to fix to support the child so that the child can thrive in the environment. So, one quote that I really like is, when a flower is not, and I'm going to misquote this a little bit, but when a flower is not thriving, we don't try to fix the flower, we fix the environment, right? So if a child is not thriving in a specific situation, we would want to think about how can we support them by changing the environment. Are they being encouraged to suppress their own unique needs in order to fit the environment? So are they being expected to sit still and stay quiet for long periods of time, such as in the classroom or things like that? Do they have, we can look at, rather than, okay, my child is making vocalizations or doing repetitive behaviors or having a meltdown, rather than I need to take my child out of this environment, or looking at I need to try to get my child to sit and be quiet, we can look at how can I adapt the environment to meet their needs. If they have some movement needs, can I bring some fidgets? Can I bring some preferred textures or objects that they like that help them cope and self-regulate in this moment? Can I give them movement breaks where we can maybe get up and walk away from the group or the crowd so that they can self-regulate and calm back down? So thinking about how can I adjust the environment to support their needs? How can I teach them to self-advocate for those needs, right? So a big important thing that we want to focus on is, how can my child ask for help? How can my child ask for a break? How can my child ask for whatever their specific needs are, right? If you have a little one, you might just start very simply by getting them to ask for help or breaks in these situations. And as they age, getting them to ask for their specific needs, right? So I need to go take a walk, or bringing headphones to help them if they're overwhelmed with their loud noise. When they're little, you might bring those headphones along. And then as they get older, helping them build the skills to ask for those headphones or to carry them with them so that they're able to use these accommodations to engage meaningfully with the environment, to participate in preferred activities and not be isolated in society because they can't fit what society expects of them. So really quickly, I wanted to highlight some neurodivergent change makers. I find when I work with a lot of families who maybe have a recent diagnosis of autism, or they don't have a lot of familiarity with the neurodiversity movement, I encourage them to maybe look into some individuals on the autism spectrum who are working to create change, who represent the autism community. And so these are a few. Again, I'm not endorsing any specific people's beliefs or perspectives. Rather, I'm just highlighting a few people that you might want to look at, because it can be really encouraging to kind of look at autism in adulthood if you have a child with autism, and kind of see what are the possibilities for my child, what are the perspectives, because a lot of these autistic self-advocates report back that I engaged in a lot of, I chewed my nails and I had a hard time in school because of this or that. And so sometimes they give you a really good perspective from the autism perspective. And so this can be really helpful for families because it kind of helps them have a deeper understanding of the why behind some of the things their child does. And they give some advice on how you can maybe support your child. So one of the most popular autistic self-advocates is Temple Grandin. She has a few books, TED Talks. There's also a movie about her. So a couple of her books are Thinking in Pictures and The Autistic Brain. She also has a TED Talk. Again, she has a couple of movies about her. She made a lot of achievements in the cattle industry, actually, because she really enjoyed patterns and systems, and she developed a system for herding cattle. And so she became really famous in the community because she overcame a lot of challenges in developing communication and language skills early on, and later on went on to become a huge advocate. She's published a lot of books on neurology and things like that. So you might be really interested to hear her story and hear about her childhood and her young adulthood, and then how she went on to make all of her accomplishments. Another one is Carrie Magro. Again, he's an autistic self-advocate who is a public speaker. He also has a book that's called Autistics on Autism. I forgot to grab it. It's on my bookshelf. But he made a compilation of a lot of young adults or teenagers on the autism spectrum and who are just starting out on their college or vocational careers. And they each wrote an essay about their experiences in school and education, and what their different support needs are, how teachers maybe considered their needs and accommodated for them. So again, it gives you a lot of feedback on how we can best support individuals on the autism spectrum and what was most meaningful for them. I also included his Instagram handle for those of you who prefer to look at these things on Instagram. Another one is Lauren Melissa Elzy. She is a writer, and she has written some articles on social justice and neuro-affirming articles. And she also has a lot of information on her Instagram. So again, there's her Instagram handle. She makes a lot of posts about different autistic traits from a strengths-based perspective and why she maybe engages in different things and why she might communicate in a different way. So that one is really helpful for families of children on the autism spectrum, because again, she gives a lot of information about how you can best support your child in self-advocating for their communication styles and their sensory needs and things like that. Another one is Haley Moss. She actually is the first autistic lawyer. She's also an artist, and she has a book called Great Minds Think Differently. She has a TED Talk as well, and she also posts information on Instagram as well. So I just wanted to leave you with a few different people that you can look at to give you more information about the neurodiversity movement and how to best support your child on the autism spectrum.